get started, a little bit of entertainment. Now, this class used to be called 007 for 25 years. That was the code number for this class. So we always start the year. Every year we always start with this, because this class for 25 years is 007, okay? So, what is this class? This class is International Banking Law International. What we're going to be doing is looking at the largest banking markets in the world, largest financial markets in the world, and trying to understand how all of these work. Now, let me just show you a little introductory video on Banking Law International. Train from Edinburgh. So, banking law, international, what are we looking at? Banking and financial markets are amongst the most important markets in the world. I won't say they run the world, but they are absolutely key for the successful operation of almost any activity, government, personal, individual, corporate, commercial, whatever. Banking and financial markets carry a number of key financial functions. We'll go over this again and again and again. There's 5 key functions. What are they? Deposit or saving, lending and credit, payment, investment, risk management. Those are the 5 key functions of financial markets. The first 3 correspond with the banking markets, the 4th one with the securities market, and the 5th one, insurance markets. So, savings and deposit, lending and credit, payment, investment, and risk management. Absolutely essential. We could not run modern society. We could not run the world without these core functions, okay? Now, what's actually happened over time is this. Banking and financial markets have developed in such a way that we have a number of different regulatory models in different countries which are tied to their specific local factors and conditions and historical development. And what we'll do during the course of this course is that we'll identify the key models, we'll understand them, and we'll try and work out which one's better, which one's not quite so good, and we'll try and form an opinion on this. What we're going to need to do is this. Banking and financial markets bring very substantial benefits, and we'll go over all of this in detail. But they also bring loss. They can be subject to horrendous crisis and financial calamity and destruction. And we saw that with the global financial crisis. Now, does that mean that markets are bad, that markets are difficult, that markets are dangerous? No, it just means that they have to be managed well. That is all. And if we manage markets effectively, they are of incredible social value. Probably one of the most important social technologies ever invented, okay? And we'll come back to that. I gave a short talk on the history of money a couple of days ago, and I talked about money as a social technology. What we'll do in this class, again, we'll have special classes on history of money, financial technology, bank balance sheet, global financial crisis, all of this, and we'll go back over all of that. So do not worry, we're going to be learning quite a lot today, but we'll go over everything in more detail as the class goes on. Now, essentially what we've done is this. We've created 2 domestic and global communities or economies. We've created an underlying trade or mercantile-based global world, but we've also created a financial world that sort of supplements, superimposed on top of that, and to a significant extent, it's possibly even larger than that. So underlying trade mercantile world is what we do in classes like trade finance, commercial law, that type of stuff. But what we do in these classes is the finance world, the new finance economy ecosystem that we've constructed on top of the global mercantile world that's developed over the last 5,000 years, okay? This is what we need to look at. Now, as I said before, there's major crises, and what we'll do is we'll summarize a lot of the key crises, but we'll learn to manage these, we'll learn to contain them, and we'll actually work out how we can basically create the best of the market conditions that we have. We almost had perfect market conditions by summer 2006. You could borrow massive amounts of money at very low interest rates. We had almost perfect market conditions. But unfortunately, being people, we managed to waste that, we managed to ruin that, and that's one of the things we need to understand. Now, what we'll do in the course of this class is, up until Christmas, next week, we'll look at the global financial crisis on its own, so we can understand it. Normally, we'd like to have a couple of introductory classes, but we don't have time. We only have 11 classes this term, so the quicker we get into the crisis, the quicker we get it over with, the quicker you will learn, settle down, get confident with it, and then we can go on with everything else. So, next week we'll do the global financial crisis. We will then do 2-3 classes on international banking and financial regulation. We will do 2-3 classes on European banking and financial regulation, and then we'll do 2-3 classes on UK banking and financial regulation, including at the Bank of England, where I work just now, and we'll also build in some American law, because I'm a New York attorney as well. That way we get a complete feel for what's actually happening in the world just now. We look at the crisis and we look at all of the post-crisis reforms, and we can do all that quite quickly in about 10 classes, 9 classes. Now what I'll do is this, I will give you a new agenda. I've summarized the whole of this term, everything I've just mentioned on one page front and back. All the theoretical issues, all the causes of the crisis, regulatory responses, all the more theoretical stuff on one page. You haven't got it yet. Don't look, you haven't got it yet. And then when you turn over, I summarize the international reform agenda, I summarize the European reform agenda, and I summarize the UK reform agenda, the American reform agenda, and then I put it all together. So what we will give you is this. There's a lot to cover, but I will give you a one-page outline that summarizes everything, okay? So by the time we get to Christmas, we understand everything there is to understand about this subject. There's a lot to cover simply because there are so many official documents now. There have been so many changes in the law before the crisis, and especially since the crisis. There's a lot to manage, there's a lot to pull together. Now, that's the basic structure of the course. Let me now mention a lot of things like materials, QM+, and everything else. We basically have an absolute excellent intranet system called QM+. This is it. Now, basically, everything you need is on here. Everything. Because I've been working on this for a number of years now. Everything is on there. All the reports, all the documents, all the commentaries, all the key materials that you need are on there. Now, as I said before, we have certain class rules. What are the class rules? You don't have to buy any books because it's all on the system. You don't even have to write because I've summarized everything on the system. I've written 70 papers on the global financial crisis over the last 9 years. Those are actually in something called the Financial Crisis Archive a bit further down. I don't even think I filled this up because there was so much stuff to go in here. But what we'll do is we'll highlight the key ones. I also record everything, so you don't even have to take notes because everything's written and everything's recorded. You don't even have to be awake. You can fall asleep if you like. Having said that, does anybody ever fall asleep? I'm not sure. I'll ask Chris, she'll know. But attendance is compulsory. The university is very strict on attendance. So no books, no writing, you don't even have to ask questions, no homework each week, no staying awake, you can sleep if you want, but attendance is compulsory, right? You must attend classes, or else it's for visa purposes. The Home Office watch all the universities now, they're very strict on this. What we'll do is we'll start bringing a toggle next week, and you use your student card and you scan it. We don't do it on the first week, but I'll bring it next week. You must attend class, or you must have a good excuse, or else the university will start writing you emails, because as I said, it's home office requirement. So the QM Plus is excellent. Everything is on here. Now the point is this, there is too much. So what you're actually going to do is learn not what not to read, what not to learn, but just how to structure your revision and structure your work. Now, for that reason, because it was getting quite heavy, what I've also done as of last year, I've prepared a study pack. And it's on the system. I'll just need to check it's the most up-to-date one is on the system. This is the study pack. So for each class, no, you haven't got it because it's about 20 pages long, 16 pages long. For each class, I summarize learning objectives, structure, reading, additional, optional reading, and an outline of the key issues we're covering. So for each class, I'll give you this. As it gets a little bit more complicated, because there is just a lot of new law to learn, for example, on the European requirements, on the global crisis, and then on the UK materials, there'll be 1 page, 2 pages, maybe 3 pages altogether, as I just summarize all the key documents you need to look at. So we identify the core materials you need for the exam, and then the supplementaries, and then the supplementaries, so that you get everything you need, okay? Because it's not easy. We've got a lot to cover this term, and because we do this every year, we get feedback from the students, and by Christmas it can become a bit exhausting, so for that reason, you now have a study pack as well. Everything's on the system, plus you have a study pack, so we can understand how we cover everything and everything we need to focus on, okay? Now, let me just mention some other things as well. For the purposes of this class, because we have this excellent room, what I tend to do is this. We tend to teach 2 to 4. From next week, we won't do it this week because it's the first class. From next week, we'll do tutorials between 4 and 5. And we'll do history of money, the last 5,000 years, we'll do the future of money, the next 5,000 years, we'll do financial technology, fintech, we'll do Bitcoin. We'll also do a bank balance sheet, and you'll be able to understand how a bank actually works. I'll give you, again, tables for all of this, summaries for all of this. And then what we'll do is we'll also contrast that with a securities firm and an insurance company, so you'll understand everything. The most important regulatory tool now is called capital adequacy, but it's quite complicated. But if you have a balance sheet and you just understand what's on a bank balance sheet, what's on the liability side, what's on the asset side, and how this moves around, where the capital fits in, where the liquidity fits in, you understand everything very simply, very clearly. And you can get control over all the most recent difficult developments in this area. Now, a lot of the law firms don't understand this, most lawyers don't understand this, most hardly accountants understand this. You will be way ahead of everybody else by the time we get to Christmas, okay? But you will have everything you need. Everything, absolutely everything is on the system. Now, what we also do is we have some fun as well. So between 4 and 5, we'll have tutorials starting next week. Then we'll have a film club. The film club is basically watching some of the best materials on YouTube. I used to actually have DVDs, which I used to bring along on the global financial crisis, Bank of England, the Federal Reserve, but I then found out everything was on YouTube anyway. So what we've actually done is we have a film club section on the QM Plus, and we have a list of all the main films that are very, very good. So if you get time, you're a bit bored one day, you want to play with YouTube, you can actually just look at our film club list. I will show you a lot of the best films on, for example, the global financial crisis. So you'll get a real inside feel for what actually happened 9 years ago. I told you before, it was the birthday of the Lehman collapse 1.5 weeks ago, on Friday the 15th of September 2008. That's when it all started. So the birthday was only 1.5 weeks ago. But we'll go back over that, we'll cover all of that. We also then decided we'll have a book club. So we have a film club and we have a book club. And what I do here is I give you a list of all of the key books on all of the developments tied to banking and financial markets and the global crisis, but also basically on everything else. And if we get time before Christmas, we'll have a special class on development law and development finance and how to fix the world. We won't just fix the banking and financial markets before Christmas, we'll try and fix the world before Christmas as well, okay? And I'll give you everything you need for that. What actually happened was this. I used to fly around the world a lot for the International Monetary Fund and other things. And I used to spend a lot of time in airports. So what do you do in an airport? You can only drink so much coffee. So you always end up in the bookshop. And I started buying all these small books, $9.99, $8.99. Nothing was ever more than £10. And I started to build up quite a collection of them. And what I realized was this: you can actually understand everything that's happening in the world just now, just with cheap paperback books bought in airport lounges. So I've now made up a list. I used to bring a bag to class with about 50, 60 of them, but then it got too big, I couldn't carry it, and I'll just give you a list. You can actually understand almost everything that's happening in the world in terms of geopolitics, gold markets, oil markets, saving the world, China, everything, just reading these books. So I've given you a list of all the best books. Now, what I encourage you to do is just have a look at this. You don't even have to read them all. It's certainly not examinable, but this makes you look very clever. Just being able to talk about this. Oh, did you read so-and-so in this? Did you read this? Oh, did you see that? Did you talk about that, right? When you go for job interviews or in wherever you work later. Now, we also decided we'll have a bit of fun as well, so we now also have a Brexit club that we're building up. We have a populism club, because populism is the big thing now, and we have a Trumpsit club after President Donald Trump was inaugurated in America. And if anybody's interested in any of this and you want to help us, let us know, okay? So it's a bit of fun on top of what you're learning. Because what you're going to do is learn a lot of the core finance law that you'll need for the rest of your life, but around that we can also build a lot of other very, very interesting things. Now, just on that, what we normally do is this. It's quite a big class, so we normally have at least 2 course assistants a year. So normally we have 1 boy and 1 girl. If anybody wants to be a course assistant, just let us know. Chris was the course assistant for last year. She's extended her attachment for 3 or 4 months before she goes back home. She did very well last year. With any luck, she'll be getting a distinction in everything she did. And she wrote a first-class dissertation on financial technology law. So if you're interested, just talk to Chris. There's very little to do. It's basically looking after guest speakers when I'm not here. That's really all it is. We don't pay you any money, but you can put it on your CV. You were the course assistant or the senior course assistant at the Centre for Commercial Law Studies in London. So we'll come back to that as well. Now, I'll also give you, now, what happened was this. I asked the class before, what used to happen was this used to be a 1-year course, and then we cut it up because the rest of the university modularized it. So now you're doing 6 courses, which used to be 3 full-year courses. You now do 2 half-year courses. Each, we split the full up to 2, so it's 3 fulls became 6 halves. It makes your CV look much, much better, although it's actually a little more difficult to manage from an examination perspective. So I asked the class, what would you prefer? Do you want examinations over Christmas? Do you want take-home exams? Do you want a paper exam before or after Christmas? Or how would you like to do this? And almost 85, 90%, 95% plus said we want an examination at the end of the year. Because what tends to happen is people aren't in an examination mood until they get to the end, until they've finished everything. By the time you get to next June, July, you will want to do your exams. You'll be ready to do your exams. It's actually quite difficult, I would think, to be doing exams halfway during the term or over Christmas or at other times. So a lot of the other courses which you will be doing all have different assessment formats. For this class, I asked everybody, and virtually everybody said they wanted exams at the end of the year. So for banking law, international banking law, finance law, and international finance law applied, we have 4 exams at the end of the year. There's only 5 questions. You only have to answer 2. It's very easy. It's very straightforward. But because of that, because you have a gap between December and next June, what we'll do is we'll have course review classes. I have a course review section on here. We'll have extra tutorials which will go over things. I also give you examination technique rules to tell you what an examiner looks for, how to get high marks, and I give you dissertation rules as well, so you can get a high mark in your dissertation. So everything is on the system that you will need, okay? Everything is on here. To some extent, there's maybe too much on here, but that's why I've also given you the study pack now, so that you can control everything. You're spending a lot of money, you've come here to work hard, we want to help you, but you have everything on here. Basically, I call this coffee law, because you could actually sit in a coffee shop and learn all of this just with a phone or a tablet. It's all on the system. You can do everything you need there, okay? Now, what we'll do is this. Let's move on to the City of London. You want to stop and start? You are in one of the most exciting cities in the world, and arguably the world's foremost international financial centre. New York's very big and exciting, Tokyo's very big and exciting, Hong Kong's very big and exciting, and we spend a lot of time in all of these, but there is something very special about London. I think London's the finest city in the world, and the more I travel, the more I love coming back here. There's always competitions, there's always scoring, there's always surveys to see what's the finest international financial centre. London is still the top. It always comes out top, just ahead of New York. New York's come closer, but it still can't beat London. London still is the centre, and hopefully even after Brexit, London will stay the international centre. London will lose some business necessarily onto the European continent, but there is nothing on the European continent yet that can compete with London. We already know this. What's going to happen is the biggest financial institutions in Britain, in London, they're going to send off some business to, they'll book some of it through Dublin, they'll book some of it through Frankfurt, they'll book some of it through Paris. But no other financial centre in Europe will take over from London. So London will stay important. So enjoy it, make the most of it, right? It's a very exciting place to be. Now, let me just tell you a little bit about London itself. I think I've given you an outline on this, or certainly on the system. What you've got is this. You've got an introduction to the whole course. You've also got an introduction to the City of London, and then an introduction to what's called the Euro-dollar markets, and we'll come back to that later. Everything I say is written up for you. Everything I say is on the system, okay? So you've got a nice little summary on City of London. I encourage you to read this at least once. It's not examinable as such, but you can build it into other larger answers. So, how old is London? London was occupied by the Romans until 410 AD. At that point, London was 330 acres around a wall. The Romans called London Londinium, and they built a wall. You can still see part of the wall. Just down on London Wall, it's actually called because it's the old Roman wall. If you come out of Charterhouse Square, you turn left, you turn right, down at the end, that's the Museum of London. You should go there at least once. See this Museum of London. It's a very good, very impressive museum. That is called London Wall because that was where one of the old Roman walls used to be. And if you walk just along past the museum on the left-hand side, you'll actually see parts of the old Roman wall still there. Now, London is famous because of what we call the City of London. The City of London is an area of 274 hectares around the Bank of England. Now, I don't know if you've heard of this. The City of London. There's London, the extended metropolitan area, with about 9 million people, and then there's this smaller city around the Bank of England, called the City of London. I said it's 274 hectares. It stretches from Bank of England at the centre, to the Law Courts in the west, to the Tower of London on the east, to the river on the south, up to Liverpool Street on the north. It's basically, we're in the top west corner of it. That's the City of London there. As you go outside, there. That's the International Financial Centre. It has its own what we call City of London Corporation. It's basically self-governed. It's like the Vatican, but it's not a separate city-state, but it has its own governing system. City of London is very famous, and it's very, very old. Now, the early City of London was structured on medieval lines until we had what was called the Great Fire in 1666. We then rebuilt it, although there was then other fires, like one in 1748 was another big fire in the City of London. And then by Victorian times, which are the 1800s, we did a lot of the modern reconstruction work. That included building all the big railroads around the centre of London, with the undergrounds coming into the City of London, as well as building higher structures, buildings, with lift systems and everything else. All of this was at the end of the Victorian period. So what you actually get is this. You get this very exciting mix. There are still parts of the old medieval alleys and lanes in the old City of London around the Bank of England, with the more modern parts built up subsequently, as well as all the even more modern infrastructure systems, with transport, electricity, lifts, lighting, and all the rest of it. But it combines both this ancient feel with this modern, very exciting metropolis. Now, we actually have 3 cities of London. with the old City of London round the Bank of England. You can actually see the edges of it if you walk down the street and you suddenly come across an iron post with a lion's head on the top. That means you're at one of the corners or one of the edges of the City of London, and you'll see them as you walk around. But London actually has three financial centres. There's the old City of London round the Bank of England. There's then also what we call Canary Wharf. That's our old Docklands. It's the same as, for example, Pudong in Shanghai. That's now where all the investment banks are, and it's one of the foremost investment banking centres in the world. Canary Wharf, you must go down and see it. Docklands, Wapping, I have an apartment down there. Beautiful, it's wonderful, by the river. It's a very exciting place. But also, in the West End of London now, that's where all the hedge funds are, the boutique investment managers, asset managers and things. So the rich ones who look after, that's rich asset managers looking after wealthy individuals, they're now in the West End. They're in Kensington, Chelsea, Knightsbridge, around a lot of the posh shops out in the West End. So London doesn't just have one centre, it actually has three financial centres. Now, there's a lot of very exciting things to do in London. There's an excellent Bank of England museum. I'm a senior fellow at the bank. You can go down to the Bank of England. I'll show you around one day, but you can go yourselves. It's free. You go to the Bank of England. On the right-hand side, just around the corner, it's a very good museum. It's got some excellent things you can see about London, money, history of banking and finance. You could spend 1, 2, 3 hours in there. It's excellent. There's some very good videos. There's some very good educational points. You can also lift up a gold bar. Feel how heavy a real gold bar is. It's a very good museum, Bank of England. Also, the City of London Museum I told you about, just around the corner, just walk 5 minutes walk from here. You should see that at least once. Again, there's the British Museum at Holborn, where our main offices are at Lincoln's Inn Field. Gallery 68 is called the Citigroup Gallery. You can see all the old money in the world. And if you go earlier in the day, there's usually an attendant, and what they'll actually have, they have an information desk, and they actually bring a lot of the old coins out. So you can actually touch coins which are 1,000, 2,000 years old. It's a wonderful thing, it's a beautiful thing. I keep trying to arrange a private tour. Maybe at some point we'll have a private tour. But they've said to me before, I think Jin's written to them because we want to go and take our own photographs of some of these beautiful old coins so we can redo all our slides and our videos. But if you're interested, go and see that. 5 minutes walk from Lincoln's Inn Field. So 5 minutes walk from here, Museum of London, 10 minutes walk from here, Bank of England Museum, 5 minutes walk from Holborn. You can see all the old beautiful coins in the world, right? Now, a lot of other things to do in London as well. The great shops, the West End in particular, you have to go to Selfridges, you have to go to Harrods. There's a lot of great markets like Portobello Road, and there's so many great markets in London. It's a very exciting place. You have to go spend time in Covent Garden, Leicester Square, Piccadilly, all of these things. Have a great time. You don't have to work too hard because we've done it all for you. It's all in the system, okay? All you have to do is have a cup of coffee every couple of hours, go into the shop, go on the system, learn about what we're doing, do 5-10 minutes work, and then you won't have a guilty conscience, okay? Just a couple of other points on the City of London. After Brexit, is London going to stay important? Of course it is. Other parts of Britain might be damaged in lots of ways a lot of people didn't predict when they voted for Brexit. I was a Remainer. But London will stay strong and London will stay important. There is something particular about London just in terms of the quality of the professional services. The law firms, the accountants, the actuaries. There is just so much here. All of the main financial markets in the world are also based in London. Still, that's not going to move. We will lose some of the euro business, some of the euro clearing, some of the business directly tied to the euro, but we won't lose anything else. And as I said before, other financial centres will pick up a little bit of business because some of the biggest firms which are based in London, they're still going to be based in London. All they'll do is book some work through Frankfurt, Dublin, Amsterdam, but it won't actually affect London as such. So it's a very exciting city. There's a lot to do here. Make the most of it, enjoy it, okay? So, now, next thing I want to go on to is coffee houses, coffee shops. One of the things people don't realize is that all of the main financial markets in the world began in coffee shops, coffee houses, in the 1600s in London. Now what used to happen was this: the water was so bad you couldn't drink out from the Thames, and there was no natural fresh running water. So basically most people drank, do you know? They drank beer. watered down beer called light beer, and if you were rich, you drank claret. And this was the same in Scotland, in Edinburgh and Glasgow. Everybody drank claret or cheap beer, watered down beer. Most people were drunk most of the time in the 14, 15 and 1600s until we started coffee shops, coffee houses. This is the truth. The first coffee shop opened in Britain in 1650 by Jacob, called the Angel in Oxford. The first coffee house in London was Pascal Rosé's coffee shop in 1652. Now you can still see it, there's a plaque. This is called Exchange Alley, which is in Cornhill. And what you have is this, you have the Bank of England. Bank of England is on Threadneedle Street. The street beside that is called Cornhill, and then the next street beside that is called Lombard Street. All the banks were in Lombard Street for hundreds of years. Bank of England is on Threadneedle Street. But what used to happen is round that very close, tight centre of London, it's still called Cornhill or Exchange Alley, round there, all of the main financial markets all began. And they all began in little coffee shops, coffee houses. Pascal Rosé had the first one in 1652. As I said, you can still see it. As you go down to the Bank of England, you take a left, you walk along the road, the little lane called Exchange Alley. It's a church. It's behind the church. There's still a plaque on the wall. It should be on here. I think we had coffee shops, a little coffee section on here. There it's there. Here stood the first London coffee house at the sign of Pascal Rosé's head, 1652. It's now the Jamaica Wine House. You can still see that. You get a real feel for London just going into these little alleys, walking around. And just imagine them full of coffee shops, because that's the way it was in the 16 and 1700s. It used to be inns, but then, as I said, everybody was drunk most of the time, or at least inebriated. I'm serious, honestly. But then what happened was they didn't invent coffee, but they brought coffee to London. Everybody sobered up, and this is the beginning of Britain really taking off. We have the financial revolution in 1688. Bank of England's formed by a Scotsman, William Paterson, in 1694. Everything starts coming together. We then have the Industrial Revolution, which all begins in Britain, early 1700s. I won't say all of it came from coffee, but this was a very important part of this, a very important early development. The first coffee houses. Now, the coffee's not like we know it today. It's not like Starbucks. It was very thick, very strong, very sweet. And you drank it by the pint, I understand. And what used to happen is this. You used to pay a penny to get into the coffee shop, and then you had an unlimited supply of coffee for as long as you wanted. But what happened was this. Everybody used to go to the coffee shops. So the lawyers and the bankers and the posh people, the lords, would all go to the coffee shops, but so did the workers and the servants and everybody else, the street cleaners. And they all used to meet in coffee shops and talk to each other. And this became a really important aspect of the coffee house and of the coffee shop culture. Everybody talked, and it became a very convivial thing. And they became like political clubs and, as I said, merchants clubs and financial clubs, market clubs. And what would happen is this. For example, all the people doing stockbroking business or business, they would meet in Jonathan's coffee shop, which opened in 1760. And out of Jonathan's coffee shop grew, does anybody know, the London Stock Exchange. Astonishing. Almost 100 years before that, 1688, in Edward Lloyd's coffee shop, all what would become the insurance underwriters and insurers, they used to meet, and that becomes Lloyd's of London. It all began in a little coffee shop, little coffee house. And what used to happen is a lot of the people who were doing shipping voyages all around the world, they would meet in coffee shops like Garraway's, the Jerusalem, Maryland. That then came together in what was called the Baltic, or it was actually the Jerusalem and Baltic, and that then becomes what's called the Baltic Exchange. That's the main shipping market in the world, still in the centre, in St Mary Axe, in the middle of London. The Lloyd's of London, the new Rogers Lloyd's of London building, and Mary Axe, the Baltic Exchange, are 4 minutes walk away, 4 minutes apart. A lot of the major markets in the world all began in coffee shops in London in the 16 and 1700s. So get a feel for that again. As you walk around London, go to the Bank of England Museum, go to these other museums, On here, we've given you a number of links to a lot of this. Just get a feel for it. There's a lot of interesting things. There's a very good, this is a website. This actually is tours, and I had a quick look last night. There's a tour coming up in about a week. If you're interested and you want tours of London, old coffee shops, coffee houses, all the things I've been talking about, you can go on it. I think it's probably free. There's another very good article in the Telegraph about a lot of the things I've been talking about. If I can go back. Very good piece in there about coffee shops as well. Lost word of the London coffee shop. Just follow it up. It's very interesting. Now, what actually happened was this. Last year, they had a sort of club whereby a lot of people, what the students did themselves, they actually did this in groups. And if you're interested, you could maybe form a group and maybe just friends, and maybe go and do some of these things, see some of these things. You will get a lot more out of your year in London if you really get a feel for this, because you can then talk about this later. It's not going to get you a job in a top international law firm, but what is going to get you a job in a top international law firm is when you go for an interview and they say, well, what did you do in London? You can talk about these things, as well as the actual specific coursework you did and your dissertation work. And we'll come back to this later during the year, okay? So there's a lot of interesting things. You can also learn about London. You can see about London. So let me leave that with you. Chris, let's start again. Okay. I said before, everything is written up. This is international banking law. What you'll have is this. On the system, people were asking me, well, what do I read? How do I learn about this? I haven't got any experience. I haven't done any of this before. Again, because of that, because people had said that before, what I've done is this. I've prepared an introduction and course overview to international financial law and regulation, international banking law and regulation. This is basically the whole course on one short paper. It's on the system. It's at the top of the QM+. Have a cup of coffee, go to a coffee shop, open it up, and you'll see this. So this basically is all the background information that you would need to know for this course. What I strongly encourage you to do is, next week we have to go straight into the global financial crisis, which is quite a lot to deal with, quite heavy. If you have time, try and look at this. I don't assign any homework, there's never any need. This is background to all of the more theoretical issues, the structure and operation of the markets, all the key definitions, all of the key terms, all in here. So, in the syllabus, we give you, or I gave you, a long list of all of the key books. There are long reading lists if you want to go off and follow them up in libraries, and you're more than welcome to do so. And I'll stress this either in this class or in the International Finance Law class. You do not have to have everything in your head all the time. The best lawyers do not know everything at all time, at all points, but they know where to get things. That's what the best lawyers can do, and that's what your training's for. So I strongly encourage you to follow up on a lot of the book lists we give you to become familiar with them so you can use them later. However, having said that, everything you need is on the system. Everything you need is on the QM+, because I've written it all up for you for this course. I'm actually writing my own books. I'm working on a 6-volume series of financial law, so everything will be written up eventually. At this stage, I'm giving you all the stuff that's ready. This is the whole course. So, financial history, financial markets, the financial system and the economy, financial intermediation, market growth, financial risk and instability, financial crisis, leading into the global financial crisis. That's all the core background material for this class, and then beginning of the next class. What I then do is, what's the rest of the course about? International banking and financial regulation, European banking and financial regulation, UK banking and financial regulation, and then United States banking and financial regulation. So again, everything summarized. So the whole of this term's course is summarized in this one paper, okay? So you can follow up on that. What we'll do is, after the break, we'll go into this in more detail. Let me just highlight a couple of points at this stage. So what we're looking at is this. Financial markets, fundamental importance, we said this before. You will need to know this, we go over it again and again and again and again. Financial markets carry out 5 key functions. What did we say before? Savings and deposit, lending and credit, payment, investment, risk management. That's what we're looking at. Financial markets at the national and international level have grown very substantially in recent years. We'll come back to this when we talk about what we refer to as the euro-dollar market. The euro-dollar markets are the main international markets that grew out of London in the post-war period. Essentially what happened was this: London was the centre of the international financial system for 100, 200, 300 years, mainly because of what was called the earlier gold standard, and I'll come back and go over all of this in more detail. If not, it's all summarised in the paper. London is very important. Becomes the largest city in the world in the 1600s. Amsterdam was very important. Amsterdam actually developed some of the earlier banking and financial practices before London, although London basically just copies them. But who developed those? The Italians. The Italians back in the 1300s and 1400s were great financiers. But London overtakes Amsterdam very quickly in the early 1600s, becomes the largest financial centre in the world, and then stays that position until now. Okay? Now, what happened was, after the First World War and Second World War, that cost us quite a lot of money, because running wars and winning wars isn't free. And basically, although we got assistance from the Americans, does anybody know what the Americans did? They gave us a bill. So everything, all the bullets and all the ammunition and everything we used, we had to pay for. We actually took out the largest loan in history just after the Second World War, and if there's time we can come back to some of this. It was actually negotiated by a brilliant British economist called Lord Maynard Keynes, King's College, Cambridge, and Keynes was actually rather old, and we'll talk about Keynes again when we talk about the Bretton Woods system, which is established after the Second World War, but I'll tell you this little story first. Who won the war? Winston Churchill, who was a Tory. But what happened just after the war? Who did the electorate elect in? Almost in a sort of fit of populism, which has become very big around the world now. Winston Churchill won the world. He was a Tory, but who did they vote in? They voted in the Labour Party straight after the war. Why? Because the Labour Party had promised, like Mr. Corbyn did, the panel is astonishing. Mr. Corbyn basically promised everything to everybody last week at the Labour Party conference. Virtually the same thing happened just after the Second World War. And although Winston Churchill won, he wasn't elected, and they brought in the Labour government. The Labour government had promised they would do all these things for all the soldiers coming back. They would build the welfare state, the National Health Service, and everything else, and that was going to cost a lot of money. So Britain had to negotiate a loan with America. Britain thought they would get a gift from America because we just won 2 world wars and saved the world, but the Americans said no. And Keynes was sent over. He was rather old, rather infirm. I think he actually died in America. He had to negotiate this loan. It was the largest loan in history. Does anybody know when it was repaid? It was only repaid in 2011. I think it was meant to be paid a little bit later, but Gordon Brown paid it slightly earlier. The largest loan in history. But after 2 world wars, the point is this: Britain had, all our gold was gone. All our foreign exchange reserves were exhausted. We had almost nothing left. We were a third world country just after the Second World War. So what happened was this: who becomes the most powerful economy in the world? What becomes the most powerful economy in the world? America. But effectively what happened was this: London still becomes the offshore centre for dollar debt. Although America becomes the most important country in the world, although the dollar becomes the most important currency in the world instead of sterling, London is still important. Why? Because the Americans, and at that point the American economy, was always over-regulated, was and still is. So where did all the big banks come? all the new money they were making all around the world, they came to London. So all the big American banks come to London and set up in London in the 1950s and 1960s, and this begins what we call the euro-dollar market. Euro-dollar. What does it mean? It means that we're dealing in dollar debt, dollar lending in Europe. The euro-dollar markets. Now there's actually three markets. One of them, the first market, was basically just a deposit market. And what that means was this. All the American banks come to London, open up business in London, and start to offer lending in dollars. And they start lending to each other. So it's a deposit market whereby we're just moving dollars between the big international banks in London. So it's a deposit market initially. But what then comes out of that are two separate markets, and we'll talk about this again this evening when we do international finance law, because the historical background is relevant to both classes. But you also get two other separate markets. You get a euro loan market, a lending market, and then you get a euro bond or security market. And what can happen is this: if you're a government or one of the biggest companies in the world and you want to borrow a large amount of money, what can you do? You either enter into a loan agreement with either one bank or a group of banks called a syndicate, if it's a very large loan, or what's the alternative? What's the opposite? You issue the debt in the form of a bond, which is essentially a security, and you sell that to the market, to investors. So you can either lend in the banking markets through loans, or you can lend in the bond markets using bond instruments, debt instruments, which are a form of security. Okay? So there's three eurodollar markets. There's the underlying interbank market, where the biggest banks in the world lend dollars to each other. And then out of that, we have two other markets, the euro loan market and the euro bond market. And we're going to do all the documentation for those. We'll do in the international finance class law tonight. What we have to understand in this class is the regulatory framework and just sort of the market background to all of this. So London becomes very important again, even after the Second World War, even though we've exhausted all our gold reserves, exhausted all our foreign exchange. We're, I wouldn't say one of the poorest countries in the world, but we are pretty poor and a pretty precarious position economically and financially, but still London survives and London thrives. And what actually happened was this: the then governor of the Bank of England, Lord Cromer, C-R-O-M-E-R, he actually encouraged this. Let the biggest banks in the world come to London. We're open for business. We're liberal, open, stable economy, stable political system, advanced rule of law with all the professional services that you need. That's why London becomes important again after the Second World War. Because we attract in the euro-dollar markets. This becomes the home of the euro-dollar markets, which are the biggest lending markets in the world, biggest funding financial markets in the world. They still are. How do all the largest governments, how do all the governments in the world borrow? They borrow in the euro-dollar markets. How do all the largest companies who need money borrow? In the euro-dollar markets, or if they've got extra funds, where do they put them? They put them in the euro-dollar markets. Okay. If you're a big American firm, you'll put a lot of it in what's called the treasury bill market. That's basically the domestic American bond market, which is very safe, very stable. The American treasury bill market is the safest, most stable market in the world. And what happened after the global financial crisis? Who caused the global financial crisis? We won't say it was the Americans, but let's say it began in America. But where did all the money go? Everybody panicked. All the money was taken out of all these new wholesale markets that we're going to look at next week. But where did all the money go? Although it began in America, all the money still went into the American bill market, because it's the safest, most stable market in the world. It's basically how the American government borrows in short-term bills. I'll give you papers on all of this in the other class, international finance law. If you want more background on this, it's on this system as well. So that's the background to the main international markets. I want to say one more thing before we have a break. There's also, I mentioned Maynard Keynes, Lord Maynard Keynes. There's also something else you need to understand, and that's what we call the Bretton Woods system. Because after the Second World War, we had to create an alternative financial system to create political and monetary and financial stability in the world. Because what a lot of people considered was this: the causes of the Second World War were largely the damage and unstable international financial system left after the First World War. And what had happened was there'd been a number of crises into the 1920s, beginning of the 1930s, in particular with the New York stock market crash in 1929, which then spreads back into America. Don't worry, all of this is in the papers. So what had happened was, because the 1930s were so unstable, a lot of people think that was the reason that it created the political instability, social and economic instability, that led to various forms of fascism, whether it's Italy, Germany, or whatever else. Almost a form of populism at that stage. It's really strange how life keeps repeating itself. The Nazis in Germany were regarded as populists. Adolf Hitler was regarded as a populist. And a lot of people think it was that instability that actually led to the Second World War. So what they wanted to do was this. They wanted to make sure after the Second World War there was no instability. What did they have before the First World War? We had the gold standard. Now I'll come back to this in more detail in the second half as we work through this paper in more detail, but let me just mention it now. We effectively had a gold standard for just over 200 years, based on the gold market in London, based on sterling. So that kept the international financial system stable from the early 1700s right up until the First World War, which started in 1914, ended in 1918. We then we tried to restore and rebuild the gold standard just after the First World War, 1918, right up until the end of the 1920s, but then 1929 we had the stock market crash. So we then had this very unstable period of the 1930s, which then leads into the Second World War. We wanted to prevent that happening again. So they had to create an alternative international financial system after the Second World War, and that's called the Bretton Woods system. What had happened was this. At Bretton Woods, which is this beautiful hotel in New England, just north of Boston in America. How do I know? Because I've been there. I was at Harvard and I hired a car, drove up one day. I looked in the map and it didn't look very far, so I thought I'll do that in 2 hours. I think it took me like 4 or 6 hours because I got there so late at night. There was no point in checking into a hotel. So my first visit to the Bretton Woods Hotel, which is beautiful, I actually slept in the car park because I got there so late at night. It's beautiful, you can still see this. There's photographs on the system, there's photographs in all the papers I put on the system. What had happened was, this is 10 months, this is July 1944, just before the end of the Second World War. The Allies knew they were going to win, but they wanted to design a new international financial system to protect the international monetary system just after the Second World War. So it's hosted by America, but the two lead countries at that point are obviously America and Britain. There was 2 key negotiators. The American negotiator was Dexter White, and the British negotiator was Lord Maynard Keynes, I mentioned before. Now, Dexter White and Lord Maynard Keynes did not like each other. Keynes was very clever, but he was also, a lot of people consider quite arrogant and quite posh, quite aloof. And Harry Dexter White did not like that. So these are the 2 key negotiators who came up with the 2 main plans to try and design a new international financial system after the Second World War, and they couldn't agree on anything. Now, because Britain financially is in a pretty destitute position by this stage after winning 2 world wars and having to pay for it, who becomes the most important economy and who's got the most influence? America. So who won? The Americans. Whose plan did we still use, or did we use? Dexter White's. This becomes what we call the Bretton Woods system, because it was the Bretton Woods Hotel. So in July 1944, they signed the Bretton Woods Treaty, and that establishes a new international financial order, international financial system after the Second World War. From 1944 right up until parts of it in 1971, and I'll explain how that collapsed with Richard Nixon in 1971, and then the rest of it still survives today. What they did at Bretton Woods was this. They established the International Monetary Fund, IMF. They established it was called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, but we all now call it the what? The World Bank. They wanted to set up an international trade organization, an ITO. That didn't work, so they agreed on what was called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT instead, the GATT. So with the IMF, the World Bank, and the GATT were all established under this system. And what they also did was, in terms of monetary management, They created an alternative, what's called a gold exchange standard, this time not based on sterling, pound sterling, but based on the US dollar. And that's what created stable international financial conditions from 1944 right up until 1971 when the system collapsed. And who benefited from all of this? London as an international financial center. This is all background for London because of these euro-dollar markets coming to London and the stability of the new international financial order we created under the Bretton Woods system. What we'll then see later is we'll see all of this begins to collapse in 1971, and that creates the new world we now live in. Why? Because of foreign exchange instability. Between 1944 and 1971, all the currencies in the world were fixed to the dollar, and the dollar was fixed to gold at $35 per ounce. It's called the Gold Exchange Standard. You fix all the currencies to one, the dollar, and the dollar's tied to gold. But Richard Nixon, after the Vietnam War in 1971, America, the economy was under quite a lot of difficulty, and there's lots of other stories I can tell you about. If there's time, we'll go into it later. But essentially what happened was this: the Americans like to spend lots of money, but they don't like to raise the tax. Again, President Trump just now, what does he want to do? He wants to spend, but not raise the tax. Americans always do this. So they had a big problem, and this put a lot of pressure on what was called the gold standard, the gold exchange standard. So Richard Nixon on the radio, 15th August 1971, was a long talk about new economic order, new economic plan, we're going to save America, make America great again, so much like Donald Trump. And then at the end of it, it was on the radio. In those days, the president didn't, it wasn't on television, but there was, I think it was a monthly radio address. And at the end he says, oh, and by the way, we're going to close the gold window. What did that mean? It meant that the Bretton Woods fixed system ended, and we moved on to floating currencies. There was a committee of 20 set up between 71 and 73 to try and create a new system. It didn't work. So from 73 onwards, we now have fully floating currencies. That's what's created a lot of the new instability in the global international financial system that we have to manage. The new world that we live in was created in 1973. Strictly speaking, 1971, with Richard Nixon closing the gold window. That's all the background to the international financial system. A lot of this is in this paper, as well as in the parallel paper. I give you exactly the same background paper, or not the same one, it's a different one. It's completely different, completely rewritten for the international finance course, but you'll get that in the other course as well, and you'll be able to see all this fits together. Anybody who wants additional reading, you've got all the syllabuses, all the extra reading is all in the study notes as well as the syllabus, okay? So what we'll do is we'll have a break now. I then want to go into this paper in a bit more detail. This is the key reading for this class. Everything you need on paper, that's all you need for next week, okay? So we'll have a 5-minute break.